I learned too late that the worst things you bring back from a war aren't the things you did. They're the things you decided not to do, and then spent the rest of your life explaining to yourself. I'm writing this now because time has narrowed for me. I can feel it in the mornings, in the way memory arrives before my feet touch the floor. I've told parts of this story before, in safe ways, the kind that don't disturb the listener. This isn't one of those tellings. I'm posting it here because no one knows my name, and because after all these years, silence has started to feel like another lie. There's one decision I made in the winter of the war that I still cannot justify. I've tried. I've had decades, and every explanation I've rehearsed falls apart when I remember the sound that followed. At the time, I thought I was choosing survival. That's what we called it. Survival was the word that made everything reasonable. I was 22 and already felt old. This was late 1944, in a stretch of Europe where the cold settled into your bones and stayed there. Even when you slept. We were dug in longer than expected, waiting on orders that changed twice a day, and meant less each time they came. Waiting was most of the war for us. Waiting for movement, waiting for shells, waiting for the sound that meant you should already be running. Hunger had a way of dulling thought. So did fatigue. We joked less by then. Conversations got smaller. Men stared at their boots, at their hands, at nothing. You measured the day by what you could still feel. When your fingers stopped hurting from the cold, you knew something was wrong. I carried a watch that winter. Not an expensive one. It had belonged to my father, and he'd pressed it into my palm before I shipped out, like it was a kind of protection. It didn't keep good time anymore. I wound it anyway. It ticked unevenly, but it was something steady in a place where nothing else was. There was a man in my unit I stayed close to, close enough that we didn't need many words. We'd arrived together and learned, without saying it, how to stand when shells came in, how to sleep in pieces, how not to look too long at what was left behind. I won't use his name here. Not because I'm protecting him, but because this story belongs to what happened, not to who he was before it. The central moment I'm writing toward happened on a morning that didn't feel important when it began. That's what still troubles me. There was no warning in the air, no sense that the day would split my life in two. If you'd asked me then, I would have told you I was thinking about coffee, about dry socks, about whether the watch was gaining or losing time. I didn't realize what that choice would cost until much later. And there's one part of this I avoided remembering for years, because once you remember it clearly, you can't hide behind orders anymore. I'll tell you how we got there. Just not all at once. 2 days passed before we heard anything. In war, 2 days can feel like a season. Enough time for the mind to build walls around what it doesn't want to examine. We were repositioned slightly, closer to the edge of the village, closer to a stand of trees that broke the wind, but collected sound. Everything carried there. A cough, a step, a voice you weren't meant to hear. It was late afternoon when the sound came. I won't dress it up. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sudden. It was a single shot, distant but clear enough that no one mistook it for artillery. It had a shape to it, a finality. My friend stopped counting. No one said anything. That was the rule with sounds like that. You didn't acknowledge them unless you had to. Acknowledgement made them real. Real meant close. Close meant dangerous. I told myself it could have been anything. An execution, yes, but also an accident, a warning shot. 100 explanations lined up quickly, each one thinner than the last. The watch ticked on my wrist. Too loud again. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing the man's shoes, worn through at the toes. I imagined them standing where he'd been told to stand. Imagined the ground beneath them cold. and unremarkable. No witnesses, no record. At the time, I still believed there was space between what I'd done and what had happened. I told myself the connection was indirect, that I hadn't pulled a trigger, that I hadn't spoken the words. But there's one part of this I avoided remembering for years. Before the patrol had taken him away, the civilian had looked at me, just briefly, and said something else. Not in English. I hadn't understood it then, or pretended not to. But later, much later, I learned enough of the language to know what he'd said. He had said, "Please remember, I didn't. Not right away. I buried the sound, buried the shoes, buried the moment where I might have interrupted the chain and didn't." I told myself this was how war worked. That meaning was assigned after the fact, by people who hadn't been there. But the sound didn't stay buried. It followed me through the rest of the campaign, through the end of the war, through the ship home, where men talked too loudly about the future and pretended the past was finished. And it followed me into the years after, when no one asked questions anymore. And that somehow felt worse, because silence doesn't erase responsibility. It just gives it time to grow. Waiting shrinks your world. After enough of it, you stop thinking in days or weeks and start thinking in intervals. The next meal, the next patrol, the next time your hands stop shaking long enough to light a cigarette. We were stationed on the edge of a village that had emptied itself ahead of us. Most of the houses stood open, as if people had simply stepped out and meant to return. Doors swung in the wind. Curtains moved like someone breathing behind them. The silence was worse than shelling. Noise, at least, had a purpose. We slept in a half-collapsed stone building that smelled of damp wood and old cooking fires. The cold never left. Even when you woke up warm, it was only because your body had given up trying to fight it. We lined our boots near a small stove and hoped they'd be less stiff by morning. Sometimes they were rent. The watch kept ticking, uneven, stubborn. I checked it too often, as if time itself might behave if I paid attention. The man I stayed close to, he had a habit of counting quietly when things got tense. Not numbers exactly, more like breaths. He told me once it helped him remember he was still here. I pretended not to notice most days. It felt like crossing a line to acknowledge how fragile we all were. Orders came down that we were to hold position. No advance. No retreat. Just hold. That meant patrols, short ones, meant to show presence more than accomplish anything. You walk a road, you come back. You look alert. You don't think too far ahead. On one of those patrols, we found something that didn't belong there. A civilian, an older man, maybe in his late 50s, early 60s. He was sitting on a low wall near what used to be a bakery. He didn't run when he saw us. Didn't raise his hands either. Just watched, calm in a way that made me uneasy. I remember noticing his shoes. They were worn through at the toes, patched with something darker. Practical shoes, the kind a man wears when he doesn't expect to go anywhere fast. We stopped. None of us spoke at first. This was enemy territory, technically. That word, enemy, did a lot of work for us back then. It smoothed over details, made decisions easier. The man spoke a few words in broken English, enough to tell us he hadn't left, enough to tell us his wife was sick and couldn't travel, enough to say he wasn't a threat. That last part was something we were supposed to decide for ourselves. I looked to my friend. He looked past the man down the street, counting his breaths. At the time, I told myself this was just another moment, another small thing. We had orders. We had rules. Civilians were to be reported, questioned, handed off. But There's a difference between knowing the procedure and believing in it. Only later did I understand what we had really done by stopping there at all, by letting the moment stretch, by pretending there was time to decide. The watch ticked. I remember that clearly. I remember thinking it was too loud, and this is where I should tell you what choice I made. But if I do that now, it'll sound simpler than it was, because the truth is, the decision didn't come all at once. It crept in, quiet as the cold, and settled before I noticed it was there. The breaking point didn't come during the war. That surprises people when I say it, but it's true. During the fighting, there was always something louder than thought. Orders, movement, dull, noise. You didn't have to listen too closely to yourself. It came later. I was home by then. Stateside. Clean clothes. Regular meals. People who wanted simple answers. They asked what it was like over there. And I gave them stories that fit in a few minutes. Stories without edges. Stories that didn't require follow-up questions. I married. I worked. I learned how to stand in line again. I learned how to sleep in a quiet room without mistaking it for danger. From the outside, I adjusted the way men were supposed to. But the watch came back with me. I had it repaired. It kept good time after that, better than it ever had before. I wore it anyway, even when wristwatches went out of fashion, even when it didn't match the rest of my life. There was a night, years later, when I woke up convinced I could still stop it, that if I acted quickly enough, I could step back into that street and say something, anything, that would interrupt what was coming. I got out of bed and stood in the dark, my heart racing, my mouth dry. I remember thinking, very clearly, this is it. This is when you finally say the words. But there was no one there to hear them. No radio to answer. No patrol to turn around. That was the moment I understood something I'd been avoiding. That the choice I made wasn't finished when the man was taken away. It kept repeating itself every time I chose silence afterward. At the time, I told myself speaking now wouldn't change anything, that the past was sealed, that bringing it up would only disturb people who hadn't earned the disturbance. Survival still made good arguments, even in peacetime. But that night, standing there with the watch ticking steadily on my wrist, I felt closer to breaking than I ever had under fire. Not because of fear, but because for the first time there was nothing distracting me from the weight of it. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I just stood there until my breathing slowed, and the moment passed. And when it did, I understood that I had missed my last easy chance to be honest. That realization stayed with me. It aged with me. And it's the reason I'm writing this now, because time, once. What makes certain moments dangerous isn't urgency. It's the opposite. It's when nothing forces your hand and you're left alone with your own reasoning. We radioed in, just like we were supposed to, gave our position, mentioned the civilian, used the right language. Calm, clipped, professional. On the other end, a voice crackled back, distant and impatient. We were told to hold the man there until a follow-up patrol could collect him. No questions, no explanation. It wasn't shouted. No one threatened us. That's important. If it had been an obvious, brutal order, maybe I'd remember myself differently. Hold him there sounded harmless enough. Temporary. Reasonable. The kind of phrase that lets you step aside from responsibility and tell yourself, you're only passing time. The man understood enough to know he wasn't free to go. He nodded slowly. Like this wasn't the first time someone had decided something about his life without asking. He sat back down on the wall and folded his hands. No anger. No pleading. That unsettled me more than anything else. We waited. Minutes stretched. The cold deepened. Somewhere in the distance, Artillery thumped, dull and regular, like a door closing far away. I remember thinking that the village had sounded different before the war. I don't know how I knew that. I'd never heard it then, but I was certain. My friend shifted his weight and whispered that we shouldn't still be standing there. Not because of the man, but because of what waiting did to your head. He said it was easier to move, even if you didn't know where you were going. I agreed with him. That should tell you something. The civilian coughed. A dry, painful sound. He apologized for it. Actually, apologized as if making noise was an inconvenience to us. I told him it was fine. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to believe kindness counted for something. I checked the watch again. The second hand hesitated, jumped, hesitated again. Time felt broken that morning, like it didn't want to move forward any more than we did. I started listing reasons in my head, reasons I didn't have to intervene further. We'd followed procedure. We'd reported in. Someone else would take over. Someone else would decide what happened next. That's how you shrink responsibility, by slicing it thin enough that it doesn't look like much when you're holding it. At the time, I didn't realize what that choice would cost. I didn't realize how permanent waiting could be, because when the sound finally came, the one that changed everything, it wasn't sudden. It didn't feel like fate or drama or tragedy. It felt like the natural next step in a chain I had already agreed to, quietly, by doing nothing. And that's the part I avoided remembering for years. Time doesn't soften everything. Some things it sharpens. As the years went on, the war became a story other people told for me. At reunions, at anniversaries, in newspaper pieces that talked about courage and sacrifice in broad, comfortable terms. I nodded along. I stood when I was supposed to stand. I let strangers thank me for things they couldn't see. No one ever asked about the man in the village. No one could have. There was no record. No report that carried his name. No line that pointed back to me. On paper, I had done exactly what I was told. That was the hardest part to live with, because the more I understood about responsibility, the clearer it became that innocence isn't the same as compliance. Obedience can be clean on the surface and still leave a stain underneath. I had followed orders, yes, but I had also followed my fear. Fear of standing out. Fear of consequences. Fear of being the one who complicated things. I thought about my friend often. We stayed in touch for a few years after the war, then less, then not at all. I never asked him if he remembered the civilian. I never asked because I was afraid of the answer, afraid that he remembered too clearly, or worse, that he didn't remember at all. There's a certain loneliness that comes from carrying a memory no one else seems to need. The watch kept time through all of it, through children growing up, through jobs that came and went, through nights when sleep was easy, and nights when it wasn't. Sometimes I'd catch myself listening to it, the way I had listened that winter, as if it might say something new if I paid close enough attention. Only later did I understand what the war had really taken from me. Not peace, not pride. It took my certainty. It took the simple belief that doing what you're told is enough to make you right. I've lived a long life, longer than some deserved, shorter than others. I don't pretend that this story balances anything. I don't expect forgiveness from you or from myself. But there is one last part I haven't said yet. The thing I hinted at in the beginning. The full truth of that decision and why it followed me for so long. Because the hardest part isn't that the man died. It's why I know he did. And that's what I need to finally say before time runs out. The follow-up patrol arrived just before noon. 4 men I didn't know well, led by a sergeant with a voice that carried authority without raising itself. He listened to our report, nodded once, and looked at the civilian like he was measuring a piece of ground, not a person. The man stood when he was told to. He didn't argue. He only asked, quietly, if someone could check on his wife. The words came out careful, chosen one by one. The sergeant said something I didn't understand in return, and that was that. They started to move him down the street. This is where I tell myself I could have spoken up. I still replay it that way sometimes. I imagine a version of myself who steps forward, who asks a question that slows everything down. Not a confrontation, just a pause. But what I did instead was look at my friend. He didn't look back. There was a reason for that. We both knew it. Looking at each other then would have meant acknowledging that this was no longer just procedure, that something had tipped from routine into consequence. So we stayed still, stayed quiet, stayed safe. I justified it the same way everyone did. We were exhausted. We were cold. We didn't know what the man had done, or if he'd done anything at all. We weren't investigators. We were soldiers. Our job was to follow orders and make it through the day. Survival makes good arguments when you let it. The patrol moved off, boots crunching softly on broken stone. The civilian didn't resist. As they passed the corner, he turned his head once, not toward me exactly, but toward where we were standing. There was no accusation in his face, just something like recognition. Only later did I understand what that look meant. After they were gone, the village felt emptier than before, like it had noticed what we'd allowed and withdrawn whatever was left of itself. My friend exhaled slowly and started counting again, under his breath. I pretended not to hear. We returned to our position. The day went on. We ate when we could. We talked about nothing. In the evening, I wound the watch and noticed it had stopped for a moment, then started again. I remember feeling irritated by that, as if the watch had failed me. That night, I dreamed of standing in the cold, unable to move my feet. I woke up before dawn with the taste of metal in my mouth, and the sense that something had already gone wrong, even though I couldn't have said what. At the time, I told myself the man was no longer my responsibility, that whatever happened next was out of my hands. But there's a difference between letting go of responsibility and handing it away, and I didn't yet know which one I had done. I said earlier that I didn't pull the trigger. That's true, but it isn't the whole truth. The reason I know the man died is simple. Too simple, really. The night before the shot, after we'd returned to our position, the radio crackled again. Not an official transmission. Just static, voices bleeding through from another unit nearby. Loose talk. Tired talk. The kind that happens when men think no one important is listening. Someone mentioned a civilian picked up in the village. An older man. Refused to leave. Suspected of helping the enemy, not with weapons, but with information. Food. Aboshi. Shelter. The voice laughed softly and said, "He won't be a problem much longer." I remember standing there, the radio cold in my hand, the watch ticking against my wrist. I remember thinking, this is when you say something. I remember not doing it. At the time, I told myself it was just talk. Soldiers exaggerate. Rumors move faster than truth. I told myself there was still uncertainty. But deep down, I knew. I knew what won't be a problem meant in that winter, in that place. I knew the chain had already tightened. When the shot came 2 days later, it didn't surprise me. That's the part that never leaves. Not the sound itself, but the recognition, the quiet confirmation of something I had already accepted by staying silent. The war ended months after that. We moved on. The village became a name on a map I never saw again. I came home. I lived a life. From the outside, a good one. But that moment stayed unfinished. I don't write this to accuse anyone else. Not my commanders. Not the patrol. Not even myself exactly. War doesn't work that cleanly. Guilt doesn't land where you expect it to. I write it because memory doesn't ask permission. It waits. And when you're old enough, when the noise of living quiets down, it speaks clearly. If you're reading this and wondering what you would have done, I don't know. I honestly don't. I'd like to believe I'd be braver now, but I've learned that courage in memory is cheaper than courage in the moment. All I can offer is this. Obedience is not the same as innocence. Silence is a decision, even when it feels like the absence of one. And some costs are paid long after the fighting stops, in small private ways no one ever sees. I don't know if remembering now counts for anything, but it's the one thing I can still do. The watch finally stopped last year. I didn't fix it this time. I think it's earned its rest.